So to start, Angular element. You can use this in the JavaScript console window, which you get in your web browser when you click the F12. So how many of you have been developing web apps? Okay, so everyone knows about the developer tools. Yes? Great. So the Angular element, you can use this to get sort of an Angular context of the HTML element. And you can, from this, get to the scope or the controller or inherited data. Scope and controller, I think you know what it is. The inherited data is when you do a binding and you bind to a variable and Angular doesn't find the variable, it actually goes to the inherited scope and looks for the value there instead. So that's the inherited data that you can get from that method. I will show you later how you can use this. So this is an output of when you type scope. And just to note, the $0 is the last selected element in the DOM. So you can use that to quickly access an HTML element. And as you can see here, Angular actually has a lot of own properties in the scope. So all the properties that are prefixed with $signs are Angular specific. But you can use this for more advanced stuff. All right, so leaving Angular element, I will come back to it later. We also have some CSS that is added by Angular. And some of these can be turned off using the debug information. But you see that you have the ng-scope, and ng-scope is added to every element that gets a new scope. So when you use ng-controller, for instance, or every time that a new scope is assigned to an element. The isolate scope is when you have a directive and the scope is sort of cut off from the parent. So this is also added by Angular in the class attribute. ng-binding is when you use ng-bind or the curly brackets. And the pristine, no, I missed one. Invalid and valid, it's used by a form element. So you have different inputs and you can use the form valid to see that every text field has a valid input or has invalid input, and you can show different data depending on the class. Pristine and dirty are related to input elements. So the pristine is used when, let's see, I'll read here. It's used by Angular ng-model directive, and it applies the ng-pristine class to a new control that you haven't touched yet. So basically every input gets the ng-pristine at the start when you open the web app, and when you click it, it gets changed to ng-dirty instead. And similarly, the touched and untouched are used by Angular to indicate that it has been focused or unfocused or blurred in web lingo. So what can you do with the CSS? Well, you can, for instance, apply a CSS border to see every child element that gets a new scope, or every binding can have some visual effect like an after effect or something. So this can be used in that regard. And you can also use this in the JavaScript console window. So using jQuery, you can look up every element that has a scope and apply some CSS to it. Using the CSS, you can also get attributes, of course. So with CSS, I think it was version 2, you could start using the attributes. And it looks like element and then the bracket attribute equals value. But if you omit element and value, you can actually search for every element that has a specific attribute, and not regardless of the value it's set to. Any questions? No? All right, so getting to another topic. This is how to turn off the debug information. So Angular applies all these CSS attributes or classes to basically allow tools to get into the debug information. So Batarang, for instance, it's a Google Chrome plugin. It looks up, when you click on an element, it lists the scope that is assigned to this element. But in production code, you often want to turn this off because it does affect performance somewhat. And when you have a large application, it gets more important, of course. So in your app config, you inject the compile provider service and you use the Debug Info enabled to turn this debug information off. And you only turn off ng binding and ng scope, but not the ng pristine and ng dirty, or valid or invalid. So those can still be used for regular or everyday usages. Also to note, when you have this debug info enabled false, you can actually turn it on again. So if you open your production application and see that, oh no, I have to debug it, you just open your JavaScript console window and you enter the angular.reload with debug info, and it will reload with all the debug information activated. So basic JavaScript debugging. So here we have some code, and this is in Google Chrome. So we can see that this, when you break, you actually get a tooltip with all the variables and their values. And you also see, well, if you hover variables, you can see values and stuff. So another interesting thing to note is the debugger statement that you can use. And I thought I'd show you. So the debugger statement is used to basically break when the debugger hits the statement. So if you have your debugger developer tools opened, the JavaScript will break when it hits the debugger statement. So this can be used when you have a large application and you enter the debugger statement in some directory, for instance, and instead of opening up Google Chrome and your web app and then going to sources and looking it up. So this is a fast way to sort of break in your code. And I'll show you how it works. So if we open, let's see, where is it? Here. If we open an app here, if we it's difficult to do this behind me. So here I have an app, and I have my configuration, I have a module, some controllers, factories. It's not pretty, I know, but it's for demonstration purposes. So I have a watch here, or two actually. So just to demonstrate, if we set some breakpoints and enter some text, we break into the JavaScript debugger. And we can hover and see all variables attached to this variable. And what I wanted you to see is if we write debugger, remove the breakpoint. Oh, I have to save first. And then run it again. That's not good. Okay, let's try this again. So there we are, we run it, and yeah, you can see the debugger breaks. So it's a nifty way to break in your code. And it's very handy when you have a large application, as I said earlier. So getting back to the presentation, and then I wanted to tell you about Batarang. So this is a tool I use very frequently, and let's see. So as I said earlier, this tool can actually access the scope for you. So if we open up the console, we have it in, no, it's smaller than I'm used to. So if we go to Elements, I don't need this actually, and select an element, this one, doesn't matter which one, I have a scope tab down here, and this is listing all the properties in my current scope for this element. When you install Batarang, you'll also get another tab which is not useful, and it ends up here. You don't want to use this because it's worthless to me, according to me. I enjoy this much more. And when I want to affect something like go in and remove or whatever, I use the Angular element, get to the scope, and then set values, because you can't set values here as far as I know. Or maybe you can. Can I? If we change this one? No. So I can't. It's bound to here. All right, so that's Batarang. I highly recommend it. All right, so a few tips. We have the debugger. Also, when moving towards AngularJS 2, you don't want to be using scope as much. You instead want to be using controller as. Is that true? Controller as. Yeah. So try to forget about using scope and use controller instead. So that way when AngularJS 2 comes along, you are already in the game and ready to start developing. Also, of course, use test-driven development so you don't have to debug your application, and instead you have your tests running every time you compile or basically save your application. And you can use, there's a lot of different frameworks and stuff that you can use for that. Also, another good thing to know is to read the documentation. This particular one is one that I found just by reading the documentation. It's when you use the resource service, is there anyone that hasn't used the resource service? All right, so resource service is basically a wrapper for AJAX calls. So you call your web server and you get a response back with all the values in JSON. And Angular will parse this to the objects that you want. So here I'm using resource to get to an entity, and the entity query method will get me a list back with all the entities from my server, and the resolved flag is false as long as the value has not been received on the client. So you could, for instance, make a spinner directive, I can show you one later, and use this flag to have that spin as long as the data is loading from the server. So that's a handy flag to use. Also, local storage. It's one that I have been using more late than early. So local storage is useful when you want to persist data in your session, because as you perhaps know, that when you refresh your page, scope variables go out of sync. So local storage can help you keep these values intact even when you do a refresh on the page. Also, there are many good to have functions in the Angular variable. So if you just type Angular in your console, you will see all of these. So copy is one that I use to, when you make, for instance, okay, so this app, it's I'm calling it mockdb, and it's a page where I can create an entity and mock up the columns of an entity, and then create entities with these columns. So here I have an entity called cars, and the cars entity has these 3 columns, and here are the values that I've entered into this entity. So this is saved on the server. So when I want to post something to the server, Angular copy can be used. So I make a copy and send the copy to the server. So that way when the response gets back, even if the local variable has been changed, the copy is still the same. So I can make queries to say that the entity you sent was incorrect, or it has been successfully added to the database. Other important methods to know are from JSON and to JSON, which can be used to, from an object, get a JSON parsed text, and the other way around, if you have some JSON text, you can get an object to query. So we can actually, if we have angular.from JSON and type a list here. So hello. Can everyone see the console? Yeah, great. Oops. And if I type this correct, if we do like this, what did I miss? We can see that it takes one unexpected token. Can anyone spot my error? Huh? Oops, sorry. So we basically just get an object. So it's similar to other, like jQuery, I think has a similar to JSON from JSON function. Which one was it more? Yeah, Angular for each is also a function I use frequently. So it's basically just a jQuery each. So you have a list and you can iterate over all the values in the list. And most importantly, disable the cache. So when you are developing and you make some changes on your server and you reload your web application and nothing works, or everything works the way it's used to, you probably forgot to disable the cache. So remember to turn that off. And you get to the settings by clicking on the cog up in the corner and then checking disable cache. All right, that was my presentation.